Welcome back everybody, I'm Nick930, and today I want to share with you my thoughts on FromSoftware's latest game, Elden Ring. Elden Ring is a third-person, open-world action RPG that is just released for current and next-gen consoles, along with the PC. In it, players will set out on an epic quest across the mysterious Lands Between, as they battle an assortment of grotesque enemies using a vast arsenal of medieval armaments, both real and fantasy-based. If you've played any of FromSoftware's games over the course of the past decade, then you'll no doubt already know what to expect here. Elden Ring is built strongly around its brutally challenging design, where even a single move can mean the difference between victory or pure frustration. But at the same time, it also manages to stand apart from its older siblings by offering a substantially larger scale, while also refining the rest of its mechanics to help differentiate itself. It has since been hailed as a masterpiece in game design, which is a sentiment I can definitely get behind. However, it's not perfect, as it does suffer from some pretty big issues in regards to its presentation and performance, and often feels needlessly convoluted just for the sake of being so. Even still, Elden Ring is undoubtedly a grand achievement for this development team, and after having spent over 40 hours with the game on PlayStation 5, I'd like to share my thoughts, starting with a spoiler-free look at the game's story and general mission structure. Elden Ring's narrative is not unlike most other FromSoftware games. While it is based around a world dreamt up by Game of Thrones writer George R.R. Martin, the core of the game's storytelling and delivery is still handled by returning FromSoftware writer and director Hidetaka Miyazaki, and has a similar delivery and overall tone to the likes of his past work. The game takes place in a fictional realm called the Lands Between, characterized by these massive, life-giving trees spread out across the land. The player assumes the role of a Tarnished, one of many who were once blessed by a great and powerful Elden Ring. Then, for reasons unknown, the Elden Ring itself was shattered, and war broke out across the kingdom, with the largest pieces of the ring having been claimed by the 6 demigod children of the lost queen Marika. As you can probably already guess, it's up to the player to help set things right, by venturing out into this war-torn fantasy world to reclaim all 6 pieces of the ring, with the hope of restoring some semblance of relative normalcy to the Lands Between. Though that's really about as much story as you're going to get out of Elden Ring. As with most Soul-style games, Elden Ring doesn't spend a lot of time with its exposition. Sure, there's a couple unique characters that you'll meet along your journey who will share their own stories in simple dialogue exchanges, but it's rare to encounter any pre-rendered cinematics or cutscenes. That's because Elden Ring intends to have players piece together their own story, based on their journeys and discoveries as they explore this richly detailed world. In fact, the game doesn't even offer any traditional open-world quest log, meaning it's up to the player to keep careful tabs on what it is NPCs have asked them to do, and where they should go next. The various checkpoints, known as Sites of Grace, do offer some hint as to where the player should be heading, but it's otherwise entirely up to the player. Which can feel a bit overwhelming at first, considering The Land Between is easily one of the most ambitious game worlds attempted by the FromSoftware team. For one, it's the first genuinely open-world environment using this Souls-like formula. Other titles like Dark Souls, Bloodborne, and Sekiro had some semblance of an open-world design. Elden Ring is handled much differently. While there is still a hub zone that can only be accessed via a loading screen, the rest of the game is interconnected through a singular, large-scale environment. This environment is vast, with wide-open valleys connecting looming cliffside castles and fortresses, and it only gets bigger as the player progresses. And it's not all just empty filler space either. Each location is densely packed with things to discover, whether they be challenging enemy encounters, valuable items, special quests from a rare NPC, or hidden dungeons carved into the side of mountains, some of which can take hours to fully explore. And all of this is accompanied further by a dynamic weather and day and night system that not only makes the journey more immersive, but can even directly impact the gameplay itself, with fog limiting the visibility of enemies, and certain enemies only appearing at certain times of day. What's even more impressive is that despite Elden Ring's more open-ended nature, the level design still feels very deliberate in its structure. You can tell that the developers didn't just take a terrain brush and toss in a bunch of repetitive level assets all over the place. Every corner of the map feels as though it has been carefully curated to ensure that there's no way to game the system and bypass a story-critical encounter. And secret items hidden up high typically have only one true intentional path to reach them, giving the feeling of genuine polish for each area of the map. Which brings us to one of Elden Ring's most unique new gameplay elements, the Spirit Steed. The Spirit Steed is Elden Ring's answer to trekking across this much larger environment, as it can be used to gallop across the lands between with relative ease, aided further by the steed's ability to not only double jump, but also blast off high in the air with the help of special boost pads at set points in the map. The steed can also be used to engage with enemies as well, giving players a chance to strike quickly with minimal threat to themselves. Though the controls and camera work do often make this more challenging than it needs to be, and I often found myself just dismounting to engage enemies instead. When on foot, Elden Ring handles very similarly to other FromSoftware games, with a lot of the same core movement controls and animations. But much like the studio's last game, Sekiro, the player can also jump, which is sometimes necessary for traversing along ruined castle structures and cliff faces. This is an area that I feel could definitely use some improvements. The platforming has never been all that important in these games, and Elden Ring isn't necessarily different in that regard. But even so, I found it incredibly awkward that in order to perform a run and jump maneuver, you need to contend with an overlapping dodge action, bound to the same button as the sprint action. Because of this design decision, I found myself having to weirdly run forward towards a ledge before holding the sprint button to avoid unintentionally diving backwards to my death. Thankfully, these types of flying leaps are rarely required, and when they are, they're usually an optional route to reach some sort of precious item off the beaten path. So it's really down to the player if they feel it's worth the risk. Another aspect carried over from Sekiro is the ability to enter into a crouched stealth stance. This I found to be extremely helpful early on, as Elden Ring purposely makes the difficulty of encountered enemies a mystery, and you'll find yourself needing to remain stealthy to bypass the more difficult enemies until you've leveled up enough to take them on. The game isn't necessarily a stealth action game, but you can at the very least lure targets away from groups to help take them down one by one, or even sneak up on an unsuspecting enemy for a powerful critical hit, sometimes killing them instantly. Which then brings us to the all-important combat mechanics. As expected, this is the core of Elden Ring's gameplay loop. The action revolves almost entirely around players defeating increasingly more challenging enemies and bosses, as they learn to master blocking, dodging, and counters. But there are a few small tweaks mixed in that I feel make combat more manageable, especially for traditionally more shield-oriented player builds. This is due largely in part to the introduction of the guard counter. As the name suggests, a guard counter allows players who have successfully blocked an attack with their shield to immediately follow up with a powerful counterattack. These types of attacks aren't necessarily as powerful as the traditional parry and riposte attack, but they're much easier to perform thanks to the more forgiving time window. The only catch is ensuring that the player's stamina is high enough to block, counter, and if necessary, roll away after a successful hit. If the player isn't careful, the guard counter can land them in a difficult position, and so it's important to really study enemy attack patterns and know the proper time to strike to minimize risk. Along with guard counters, players can now tie in their new jumping ability to both dodge certain attacks and perform devastating vertical strikes, sometimes staggering the enemy for a powerful critical follow-up. Elden Ring also sees a slight change to its healing systems. Not only can you refill health flasks at any found checkpoints, but by defeating groups of enemies or destroying special scarab beetles, players can now be rewarded with an extra refill, which should help to cut down on the need to backtrack and keeps the pace of the action more consistent. But even with these new tools at the player's disposal, Elden Ring remains a brutally challenging game, and so players are going to need to make careful use of the expanded progression system if they want to stand a chance in the lands between. As always, progression in Elden Ring is measured mainly through the player leveling system that tasks players with acquiring points, or runes, and then spending them at checkpoint areas in any of the 8 attribute categories. The catch is that the number of runes necessary to level up gets progressively higher with each level, forcing players to tackle more and more challenging enemies. And if the player is ever killed, any unspent runes being held at the time will be dropped on the ground, and must be retrieved before dying again. For FromSoftware fans, this is a fairly typical design element, offering an addictive risk-reward gameplay loop that's intended to keep players returning over and over again in hopes of preserving their hard-earned XP. And while it can be exceptionally rewarding to finally overcome a challenging boss and reclaim all of those lost runes, it can also be equally frustrating upon failure. Though it's worth noting that replenishing runes is not at all difficult, as most enemies, with the exception of bosses, will respawn after each death or checkpoint, making for an infinite supply of XP to farm and rank up with. And even if you end up disliking your character build late in the game, there's even options to respec your character and set up a new build to suit your evolved playstyle. Though, the main leveling system isn't the only gameplay system to consider. Elden Ring also offers a separate progression system for each individual weapon. By using found smithing stones, players can visit blacksmiths and level up weapons to greatly improve their effectiveness. Additionally, each weapon can now have special skills applied called Ashes of War that will replace any pre-existing moves tied to the weapon already with a move that the player may prefer instead. Along with this, players can use collected gold seeds and sacred tears to upgrade their health potions, crystal tears to mix together temporary player buffs, spellbooks to use unique elemental magic, and make use of an extensive crafting system to use common resources found throughout the world and piece together helpful tools and enhancements. There's a lot of different progression systems to keep track of, but because Elden Ring presents each of these at a comfortable pace, it never gets to be too overwhelming, and ensures that players, even after dozens of hours, are still discovering new ways to improve their character. Then we have multiplayer. This is an area that I feel Elden Ring really struggles with at the moment. Like with most other Souls-style games, the multiplayer here is not handled the same as most traditional video games. You can't just open up the game menu and join on your friends and then run through the story together. Instead, Elden Ring is built around a summoning system, where players can request help from other players around their general location to assist temporarily with either a difficult area or, more likely, a difficult boss. But this unusual approach to cooperative play isn't what I have a problem with. What's problematic is the fact that the system simply isn't working in its current state. When faced with a difficult boss, I decided to give the feature a try, only to find that no matter what, I could not summon a player to join my game, with connection errors popping up repeatedly every time I tried. I was able to easily search for other player matches, which typically worked within a few seconds, but latency and hit registration were also problematic, with perfect hits landed on enemies not registering for several seconds at a time. Competitive player invasions also make a return, but they don't feel as common, and while you can definitely still search for opponents to challenge just fine, it seems as though the minimum player level for these random invasions to trigger is much higher than it has been in the past. Finally, we have Elden Ring's biggest weakness, its presentation. To put it bluntly, Elden Ring looks fairly dated, with flickering shadows, low jaw distances causing excessive pop-in, and some really bland lighting. It can at times look great, thanks to a brilliant art direction and a confident style that fans of these games will no doubt love. But this is certainly not pushing any technical boundaries. What makes this even more disappointing is the terrible performance. For my playthrough, I used the PlayStation 5 version of the game, set to its quality preset, and I found that the average performance would regularly fluctuate depending on the scene, making for a fairly unstable experience. Oddly, FromSoftware seems to have left the frame rate unlocked regardless of the visual mode selected, which makes the performance feel really shaky at times. And even when set to performance mode, the PS5 version of Elden Ring still fails to maintain a steady 60 frames per second, and is reportedly being outperformed by the PS4 version played on the PS5 instead. There was even an instance where my frame rate dropped into slideshow territory during a boss fight, though this was a one-time event that I wasn't able to replicate. Now, I personally haven't been able to test the game on the Xbox or the PC, but these two platforms seem to be suffering from some similar issues as well, something that I hope FromSoftware will address sooner rather than later. Overall, Elden Ring is not a masterpiece, but it is really close. It's undoubtedly one of the most ambitious titles ever released from FromSoftware, building off of everything learned from its long line of successful titles. Only it mixes those aspects in with its own take on the traditional open world formula. One of its biggest strengths is that instead of just throwing a checklist at the player and telling them to get to work, players are free to discover the world however they like, and they're only subtly nudged to follow an intended path based on smart enemy placement and level design. Along with this, every feature feels like it has been put in place for a very distinct purpose, something that the studio has always excelled at in the past. However, there are lessons that I feel still haven't been learned here that would have improved the game further. Keeping a log of conversations with NPCs in the game's menus, or even discovered objectives, would not rob the game of that mystery, but would instead help players who might have stepped away for a while to be able to jump right back in. And cleaning up the wonky movement and jump mechanics would lead to players focusing more on the actions that they're performing, rather than trying to wrestle with awkward button configurations. Though even these arguable design choices would have been excusable if it weren't for the major technical issues plaguing the game at the moment, including persistent co-op connection errors and unstable performance. Though I have no doubt that these issues will be resolved at some point. And when they are, I can confidently say that this game certainly does live up to the hype. So, what do you guys think? Are you enjoying Elden Ring? Let me know in the comment section, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more content like this posted every week.